Jennifer Parker hurried through the dimly lit streets of Turingham, clutching her worn handbag as if it held more than the few crumpled bills and spare coins she had earned that day. At 29, life had etched its challenges deep into her spirit. The relentless struggle to balance her nursing classes with the mounting bills loomed over her like a dark cloud. Dreaming of a better future felt indulgent when mere survival consumed her every waking moment. As she turned onto Chestnut Avenue, her thoughts drifted. She barely noticed the heap on the wet pavement until she was nearly upon it. At first glance, it looked like a discarded pile of trash, beaten down by the evening rain. But as she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. A man lay motionless on the sidewalk, his expensive suit soaked through and clinging to his body. The pale glow of his face, illuminated by the erratic flicker of a street lamp, seemed almost ghostly. Jennifer's heart raced as she dropped to her knees beside him, her voice trembling. "Sir?" she called out, her tone betraying her rising panic. Gently, she shook his shoulder, but there was no response. Fear clawed at her chest, but years spent caring for her sick mother had instilled a quiet resilience in her. Her hand steadied as she reached for his neck, searching for a pulse, faint but present. She tilted his head back, her training kicking in. His airway was partially obstructed, and he wasn't breathing. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the drumming rain. Jennifer's hair clung to her face, rain streaming down her neck, but she didn't hesitate. She pressed her palms against his chest, beginning rhythmic compressions. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice firm but desperate. The street lamp above buzzed ominously, casting fragmented shadows across the scene. Who was this man? How long had he been lying here, unnoticed? Tyringham wasn't a town where people went overlooked, but the storm had driven most of its residents indoors. After what felt like an eternity, the man convulsed, gasping violently as his lungs filled with air. Jennifer exhaled sharply, relief coursing through her. "You're okay," she murmured, though the sight of his pallid skin and shallow breaths told her otherwise. His eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a piercing gray that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, before they closed again. The wail of sirens broke through the rhythmic pounding of the rain. Red and blue lights illuminated the street as an ambulance pulled up. Paramedics rushed out, their practiced movements efficient and precise. Jennifer backed away slightly, her hands trembling as the medics assessed the man's condition. She watched in silence as they worked, a mixture of relief and lingering dread filling her chest. She didn't know who he was or how he had ended up here, but she had done her part. As the ambulance sped away, its lights fading into the stormy night, Jennifer stood alone in the rain, her soaked clothes clinging to her like a second skin. Her heart beat heavily, not just from exertion, but from the unshakable feeling that this moment, this man, would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. A paramedic turned to Jennifer Parker and asked, "Do you know him?" Jennifer shook her head, pushing damp strands of hair away from her face. "No, I just found him here," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "You saved his life," the paramedic said, a note of admiration softening her tone. Jennifer nodded, her movements robotic, as if her body was acting on autopilot. She stepped back, allowing the medics to shut the ambulance doors. The vehicle sped off, its sirens wailing, the red and blue lights dancing across the rain-soaked pavement. For a moment, Jennifer just stood there, shivering as the adrenaline drained from her system, leaving behind a strange emptiness. The quiet of Tyringham settled around her once more, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain against the pavement. Everything about the moment felt surreal, as if she were trapped in a dream she couldn't quite shake. Who was he? The question echoed in her mind, persistent and unanswered. Her gaze dropped to her hands, still trembling, their skin raw and reddened from the forceful CPR compressions. She had acted on instinct, as she always did, but now the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. Jennifer took a slow breath and turned toward home, her footsteps heavy against the slick pavement. "Just doing my duty," she murmured to herself, the words barely audible over the rain. Yet as they hung in the air, they felt oddly hollow. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place. His presence lingered in her thoughts like an unresolved melody, a quiet pull that refused to be ignored. His pale face, the flicker of his gray eyes, and the way the rain had clung to his expensive suit, all of it had etched itself into her memory. The storm continued to fall around her as she walked, but Jennifer barely noticed. It wasn't just the man's survival that weighed on her. It was the unshakable sense that their paths had crossed for a reason she couldn't yet understand. Though her thoughts felt hollow, something about the man lingered in Jennifer Parker's mind. His aura, a mix of affluence and fragility, stirred an unease she couldn't quite shake. She had no way of knowing how intertwined her life and his were destined to become. By the time Jennifer arrived at her modest apartment, the storm had begun to wane. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, the rain's chill seeping deep into her bones. She dropped her bag onto the worn counter in the tiny kitchen, its surface scratched and stained from years of use. The familiar scent of damp wood greeted her, wrapping the space in a sense of bittersweet familiarity. The dim overhead light buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows on the peeling linoleum floor. Jennifer shrugged off her drenched jacket and draped it over the back of a chair, droplets pooling on the floor beneath it. Despite her efforts to push the evening's events from her mind, her thoughts returned to the man she had found crumpled on the sidewalk. Soon she knew the phrase, but what she hadn't been able to remember, and what she hadn't been able to remember. It wasn't like her to dwell on strangers. Life in Tyrium had taught her to keep her head down, focusing solely on her own survival. Yet his image, his pallid face illuminated by the flickering street lamp, was burned into her memory. Who was he? What could have brought him to Tyringham, a town so unremarkable it rarely drew visitors? Her fingers trailed absently along the edge of the cracked countertop as she leaned against it, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the drizzle continued, soft and persistent, blurring the outlines of the quiet street below. In the distance, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign pulsed unevenly, like a weak and faltering heartbeat. That sign had been a constant in Jennifer's life, a beacon for countless late-night shifts. She had grown up in Tyringham, surrounded by its tranquil streets and unassuming homes. This town was her whole world, a place where time seemed to move slower, where dreams often felt too big for its narrow boundaries. Her mother, Sarah, had always called Trainingham a sanctuary. A safe haven, she used to say, her voice full of optimism that Jennifer could never quite share. But as Jennifer stood in her tiny kitchen, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, she realized she couldn't remember a time when life had felt truly safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Jennifer's thoughts drifted back to the man, his face pale and vulnerable against the night's storm. Something about him stirred questions she wasn't ready to answer, yet she couldn't deny the pull. Who was he? And why did she feel as though, somehow, their lives had been set on an unexpected collision course? Sarah Parker had worn herself to the bone, determined to keep a roof over their heads after Jennifer's father abandoned them. Jennifer was just 7 years old when the weight of their new reality descended on her. The memories of her mother's final years, frail, confined to a bed, her voice reduced to faint murmurs, clung to Jennifer like an indelible shadow. Once, Sarah's laughter had filled their small home, strong and unwavering. Now it lingered only in Jennifer's heart, a bittersweet echo of what had been lost. The medical bills from those grueling years still loomed over Jennifer's life like a storm cloud. She spent her days hustling through double shifts at the diner, balancing trays of coffee and greasy plates with an efficiency born of survival, not choice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she would trade her apron for textbooks, retreating to the library to immerse herself in her studies. Her dream of one day donning scrubs, of offering the care she hadn't been able to give her mother, was what kept her moving forward. She clung to that vision like a lifeline, whispering to herself late at night, "Maybe someday." The words were hollow but familiar, a mantra she had repeated so often it felt like part of her being. They were a fragile promise she willed herself to believe, a flicker of hope in a sea of challenges. The sharp ring of her phone jolted Jennifer from her thoughts. She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly, the adrenaline from the night's events still coursing through her veins. The screen lit up with the name Julia. A faint smile crossed Jennifer's face as she answered. "Hey, Jen," Julia's bright, familiar voice chirped on the other end. "You holding up okay?" Jennifer hesitated for a moment, her voice quiet. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had an unusual night." "Unusual how?" Julia asked, her curiosity piqued. Did old Mr. Wilcox finally pop the question? Despite herself, Jennifer chuckled softly. "No, nothing like that. I found a man on the street. He wasn't breathing." Silence filled the line for a beat, and Jennifer could picture Julia's wide eyes on the other end. "Wait, what? Are you serious? What happened?" Jennifer recounted the evening in a measured tone, her voice steady but subdued. She described stumbling upon the man's motionless body, rain soaking his tailored suit, and her frantic attempts at CPR in the downpour. "Wow," Julia breathed after a moment. "That's intense. Do you know who he was?" "Not a clue," Jennifer admitted. "But he didn't look like he belonged here. Not in Tyringham." "Well, you're a hero, Jen. You saved his life. Maybe he's some wealthy executive who'll send you a car or something." Jennifer rolled her eyes, though she couldn't entirely dismiss the flicker of curiosity. His suit had been immaculate, tailored to perfection. Even his watch had caught her eye, its gleam undeniable under the dim street lamp. He was the kind of person who seemed miles removed from Tyringham's quiet streets. "Sure," Jennifer replied dryly. "Maybe I'll wake up tomorrow with a yacht waiting in the driveway." Julia laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Hey, you never know. Stranger things have happened." Their conversation meandered after that, drifting toward lighter topics. They gossiped about the latest diner drama and speculated about the turnout for the upcoming charity bake sale. The mundane chatter wrapped around Jennifer like a comforting blanket, easing the tension that lingered from the night's events. Eventually, fatigue crept in, and Jennifer stifled a yawn. "I should get some sleep," she said. "All right," Julia replied. "Night, Jen. And seriously, you did an incredible thing tonight." As the call ended, Jennifer set the phone on the nightstand and slipped beneath the worn quilt on her bed. The faint hum of passing cars filtered through her window, a distant lullaby against the quiet of the apartment. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, but her thoughts remained restless. The image of the man's pale face and the weight of the moment wouldn't let go. Who was he, she wondered? Why had their paths crossed in such a strange, fleeting way? The questions lingered as Jennifer drifted into a fitful sleep, the mysteries of the night settling over her like the rain that still whispered against her window. Jennifer Parker's thoughts wouldn't quiet, the events of the night replaying endlessly in her mind. The image of the man's face, pale as porcelain and etched with fleeting pain, followed her even into her dreams. Across Tyringham, in the town's modest hospital, the man lay motionless in a sterile room. The soft, rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, a steady backdrop to the whispered conversations of the nurses. His tailored clothes and air of mystery had sparked quiet speculation. One nurse, her movements gentle, adjusted the blanket covering him, unaware that his waking thoughts would soon center on the woman who had saved his life. In the quiet of the room, Nicholas Hunter began to stir. Consciousness clawed its way through a thick fog, dragging him into the present. The repetitive cadence of the heart monitor grounded him, steady and insistent against the chaotic jumble of his thoughts. His entire body ached, weighed down by an invisible heaviness. The faint, sterile scent of antiseptic teased his senses, a sharp reminder of his surroundings. With great effort, Nicholas opened his eyes. The harsh fluorescent lights above him sent a jolt through his temples. Blinking slowly, he took in the unfamiliar setting. A cold, clinical space, stripped of warmth or familiarity. "Mr. Hunter?" A soft, measured voice interrupted his disorientation. A nurse, middle-aged and exuding quiet confidence, stepped closer. Her kind eyes searched his face, her clipboard held firmly in her hands. "Yes," he managed, his voice hoarse, scraping against the dryness in his throat. "Where am I?" "You're in Tyringham General Hospital," she replied gently, setting her clipboard on the bedside table. "You were brought in last night. A passerby found you unconscious and performed CPR until the paramedics arrived." Her words were measured, but Nicholas felt them strike like a hammer. He closed his eyes briefly, fragments of the night flickering behind his lids. The rain, the cold, and a voice urging him back to life. "Who?" His voice faltered, then steadied. "Who found me?" The nurse hesitated, her lips pressing into a thoughtful line. "I'm afraid I don't have her name, but from what I've heard, she likely saved your life." Nicholas turned his head slightly, staring at the muted colors of the room. The woman's face, blurred but undeniably determined, floated in his mind. He clenched his jaw, the weight of gratitude and curiosity settling deep within him. "Thank you," he murmured, though it felt woefully inadequate for someone who wasn't present to hear it. As the nurse made notes on her clipboard, Nicholas stared at the ceiling, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors fading into the background. Somewhere in Tyringham, a stranger had acted selflessly, saving him when he had no right to expect it. And as he lay there, his resolve hardened. He would find her. He had to. "You're at Tyringham General Hospital," the nurse explained, her voice a gentle balance of compassion and professionalism. "You suffered a cardiac episode. Someone administered CPR and saved your life before the paramedics arrived." Nicholas Hunter furrowed his brow, a deep line of confusion forming as he tried to make sense of her words. His memories were fragmented like a shattered mirror, the pieces refusing to align. He closed his eyes, grappling for clarity. The cold sting of rain against his skin resurfaced, paired with the faint recollection of breath forcing its way back into his lungs. A fleeting image of a woman appeared, a figure illuminated by a flickering street lamp. Her hands had been steady, her voice commanding yet urgent, urging him to fight. But the details danced just out of reach, dissolving like smoke the harder he tried to hold on. "Who?" His voice cracked, hoarse and raw, the effort of speaking weighing heavily on him. "Who saved me?" The nurse's expression softened, though her answer was tinged with regret. "We don't know," she admitted. "She left before the ambulance arrived. From what we've heard, she saved your life. You're very fortunate." Fortunate. The word hung hollow in Nicholas's mind as he shifted slightly on the hospital bed. His limbs felt weighted, his head clouded and heavy. He glanced around, taking in the room's stark simplicity. The whitewashed walls, the hum of fluorescent lighting, and the scuffed linoleum floors. This wasn't the sleek comfort of the private hospitals he was accustomed to in Los Angeles or New York. The nurse busied herself adjusting the IV in his arm, her movements calm and efficient. Nicholas let his gaze drift toward the ceiling, his thoughts tumbling over each other as he tried to reconstruct the lost hours. He remembered his car cutting through the rain-soaked streets of Tyringham, the headlights illuminating the darkened road ahead. He had come to this quiet town for a land acquisition meeting, but everything beyond that moment dissolved into chaos. As the nurse stepped back, Nicholas's jaw tightened. The gaps in his memory gnawed at him, but one thought remained clear. A stranger had saved him. A stranger whose face he couldn't quite picture, yet who had been close enough to hear his faltering breath, steady enough to pull him back from the edge. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Nicholas's hand rested against the thin hospital blanket, his fingers twitching slightly, as if reaching for answers. He didn't know who she was, but he was certain of one thing: he had to find her. Nicholas's wandering thoughts were disrupted by the arrival of a man whose presence commanded attention. His tailored suit and impeccably polished shoes seemed out of place against the backdrop of Tyringham General's humble floors. With sharp features and perfectly styled hair, he exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Nicholas," the man began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of concern. "It's a relief to see you awake. You had us all on edge." Blinking, Nicholas squinted at the figure before recognition settled into his weary expression. "Dennis?" "Yes, sir," Dennis replied, his tone crisp as always. "I got here as soon as I received the call." Dennis Lane, Nicholas's trusted assistant and the ever-present manager of his tightly orchestrated life, placed a sleek briefcase on the chair beside the bed. His discerning gaze swept over Nicholas, noting the pallor and the faint lines of fatigue etched on his features. "You've had quite the ordeal," Dennis remarked, his tone softening slightly. "The doctors say it was brought on by stress. Cardiac arrest triggered by exhaustion and overwork." Nicholas released a dry chuckle, devoid of any amusement. "That sounds about right," he murmured, his voice tinged with resignation. For a moment Dennis hesitated, the polished veneer of his professionalism giving way to genuine concern. "Do you remember why you were in Tyringham?" Nicholas closed his eyes, his forehead creasing as he strained to piece together fragments of memory. "The land deal," he said finally, his voice slow and deliberate. "I was supposed to meet someone about a property." Nicholas nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he processed the information. "I was here to look into a piece of land," he murmured. "It was somewhere on the outskirts of town." He hesitated, then added, "Before the meeting." "What happened?" "My car was found, but I wasn't." Dennis adjusted his stance, his usual composed demeanor tinged with unease. "Your vehicle was parked along the roadside near a turnoff. You were found collapsed a few blocks away. We're still piecing it together." His companion patiently explained the situation. Then Dennis adjusted the steering wheel to bring the vehicle to a halt. Nicholas's mind fixated on a fragmented memory, a fleeting glimpse of determination etched on a stranger's face. It was a woman, steadfast despite the storm, fighting to save him. "The person who helped me," he pressed, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and urgency. "Do we know anything about her?" "Not yet," Dennis admitted cautiously, his words carefully measured. "But I can start asking questions. If she's from Tyringham, someone will recognize her." "Do it," Nicholas commanded, his exhaustion failing to dull the steel in his tone. "I need to find her." Dennis nodded, his brow creasing slightly as he stepped aside. Within moments his phone was in hand, his quiet efficiency already at work as he made inquiries. Meanwhile, the nurse returned to check Nicholas's vitals, her practiced hands ensuring his monitors were steady. Nicholas leaned back into the pillows, his thoughts consumed by the woman who had saved him. Gratitude churned with an unshakable restlessness. He had faced moments of peril before, business gambles, personal heartbreaks, but this was different. This wasn't a risk he had calculated or a challenge he had controlled. This was life and death, and the scales had tipped because of someone else's selflessness. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor echoed in the sterile room, a sharp contrast to the storm raging in his mind. Somewhere in Tyringham, a stranger had braved the rain, knelt beside him, and pulled him back from the brink. As Nicholas stared at the ceiling, a vow took root in his heart. He would find her. He had to. He didn't yet realize that this promise would ripple through their lives, reshaping them both in ways neither could foresee. Here's the rewritten version of the content. In her modest Tyringham apartment, Jennifer Parker tried to lose herself in her routine. The previous night's events hung over her like a shadow, refusing to fade. The small space, filled with a mismatched assortment of second-hand furniture and lit by a dimly buzzing lamp, offered a fragile sense of comfort. Jennifer settled at her scuffed kitchen table, a worn nursing textbook spread open before her. She traced the detailed anatomy diagrams with her finger, trying to focus. Yet the image of the man she had found, the pale skin, the weak pulse, invaded her thoughts like a haunting question demanding answers. Earlier, she had shared the surreal experience with Julia over the phone, but now, in the stillness of her apartment, the weight of it felt sharper, heavier. Who was this man? His tailored suit and glinting watch didn't fit with the sleepy simplicity of Tyringham. What had brought him here, only to end up collapsed in the rain? Jennifer cradled her favorite mug, the warmth of the tea seeping into her palms. Her mind churned, circling back to the unsettling questions she couldn't answer. In a town as unassuming as Tyringham, life rarely veered into the dramatic. For most of her 29 years, Jennifer had kept a low profile, content to slip through the days unnoticed. But now, something had shifted. A curiosity she didn't quite understand had taken root in her heart. The memory of his lifeless face stirred something deeper, pulling her from the quiet rhythm of her usual existence. As she sat there, surrounded by the familiar yet suddenly insufficient walls of her small apartment, Jennifer couldn't help but wonder. What story had begun that night in the rain? Jennifer Parker's shift at the diner that afternoon unfolded in its usual rhythm. Yet, her lingering distraction didn't go unnoticed by the regulars. Old Mr. Harrowell, a fixture at the counter who never skipped his nightly slice of apple pie, squinted at her thoughtfully. "You're quieter than usual today, Jennifer," he commented as she refilled his coffee cup. She offered a polite smile, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Just a long night, Mr. Harrove. Nothing a good sleep won't fix." He nodded knowingly, but his eyes followed her as she moved through the room. In Tyringham, everyone knew everyone else's patterns, lives wove together in a tapestry of shared history and mutual familiarity. It was a source of comfort, but also a reminder of how little remained private in this small town. Tyringham's tightly knit fabric made secrets a rare luxury. After clocking out, Jennifer made her way to the library, a place that had always felt like home. The creak of the old wooden floors and the faint scent of aged paper wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. She settled into her usual corner, a quiet space nestled between rows of bookshelves. Opening her notebook, she tried to focus on her studies. But as she glanced out the window, her thoughts drifted once more to the man she had saved. A faint smile touched her lips as Julia's teasing words echoed in her mind. Maybe he was some kind of millionaire. Not that it mattered, Jennifer reminded herself. She wasn't the sort to expect recognition, let alone grand gestures of gratitude. Her actions had been instinctive, born from years of caring for others. "Jennifer, there you are." Julia's voice broke through her reverie, bright and full of energy, pulling Jennifer back to the present. "Jennifer, there you are!" Julia's voice broke through the quiet hum of the library, jolting Jennifer Parker from her thoughts. She looked up to see her best friend weaving through the rows of bookshelves. With her fiery red hair and animated expression, Julia stood out like a burst of color in the subdued tones of the library. "Shh," Jennifer teased, pointing at the quiet zone sign hanging on the nearby wall. "What are you doing here?" Julia slid into the chair across from her, her eyes alight with mischief. "I came to see you, of course. I couldn't stop thinking about your mystery man. You have to admit, it's thrilling. A millionaire in Tyringham? Who'd have guessed?" Jennifer sighed, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "You're jumping to conclusions. He could be anyone, Julia." "Please," Julia scoffed, leaning in conspiratorially. "Normal people don't pass out wearing suits that cost more than my car. I'm telling you, he's someone important. Maybe a corporate mogul or a high-profile politician, who knows? You might have saved someone famous." Jennifer shook her head, closing her textbook with a soft thud. "Even if I did, it doesn't matter. He's gone now, and I'm back to cramming for exams and pulling double shifts. End of story." But Julia wasn't about to let it go that easily. "You're way too modest, Jen. What you did was incredible. People are going to notice when they hear about it." Jennifer frowned, her brow knitting in concern. "I hope not. I don't want attention, Julia. I just want to focus on my classes and get through this semester." Julia leaned back in her chair, studying her friend with a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You know, not everyone would have done what you did. That man owes you his life, and whether you like it or not, that's a big deal." Jennifer bit her lip, her gaze drifting to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the room. She didn't need a spotlight, didn't want one, but in the back of her mind, the memory of the man's face, pale, vulnerable, and fleetingly human, refused to fade. Jennifer hesitated, her words hanging heavily in the air. And then what? The unspoken question lingered, pressing against her thoughts. Julia tilted her head, her playful smirk softening into something more thoughtful. "You know, Jen, you deserve better than this. You've always been the one holding everyone else together. Maybe it's time someone did the same for you." Jennifer opened her mouth, searching for a response, but no words came. She loved Julia's boundless optimism, even if it often clashed with her own grounded realism. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that her friend might be right. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something waiting for her beyond Tyringham. A future she hadn't dared to imagine. It astonished Julia to think such things possible. The two friends stepped out into the crisp evening air, the faint scent of fallen leaves carried on the breeze. The stars above scattered like tiny lanterns against the dark canvas of the sky. Jennifer exhaled, her breath forming delicate clouds in the cold. "Thanks for coming by," she said softly. "I needed the distraction." Julia grinned, looping her arm through Jennifer's. "Anytime, Jen. And hey, if you ever figure out who that guy is, promise me I'll be the first to know. I want all the juicy details." Jennifer laughed, shaking her head. "Don't hold your breath, Julia." They parted ways at the corner of Maple Street. Jennifer watched Julia's fiery hair bounce as she disappeared into the night, her light-hearted presence leaving an almost tangible warmth behind. As Jennifer continued her walk home, the quiet streets felt subtly changed, as if the town itself were waiting for something. She shook off the thought, forcing her mind to focus on practicalities. The stack of overdue bills sitting on her counter, and the exam looming on the horizon. But as she stepped through the door of her small apartment, the lingering stillness of the night followed her. It stirred something unspoken in her heart, a flicker of hope, or perhaps a sense of change. Life carried on as it always had for Jennifer Parker, steady but uninspired. Yet, as she slipped into bed that night, the man's face lingered in her thoughts. His image was like a missing piece of a puzzle, stubborn and unresolved. Somewhere out there he was healing, she told herself. That should have been enough. But a quiet voice in her heart whispered otherwise. Their story, it seemed, wasn't over yet.